There we go. All right, we're still in Mark. I'd like to finish Mark, but they're going to do that. They're going to do so many classes in the regular class, and they're going to have some kind of special class, so I don't know what's going on. But that's all right. We'll just roll with the punches. Tammy says I'm supposed to be someplace during part of that time, so that'll probably work out either way. I follow her instructions and directions. Okay, the words for today. I thought you'd like these words because these fit with part of what we looked at yesterday. And I'm not going backwards, but I'm going to go back just a couple of verses. But here's the ones, let's see, K-A-L-A-M-O. Kalamos. This is a reed. A reed. As opposed to a zulon. A zulon's a stick, piece of wood, right? This is a reed, literally. There are other words for reed, but a kalamo, if you go look, it's like a very thin reed, kind of like the kind you find like a cattail, for example. That's about all it is. In fact, this word is used more than once in Mark. The other place we see it is later on when they offer Jesus the sour wine on the cross. It's also a kalamo, not a stick. And this word, this is C-H, R-E. Caro, cario, cario, carera. This is a word that when the angel came to Mary, he says, Caris, cario, hail, Mary, full of grace, right? This is the word that is the basis for charis. Everyone know what charis is? Charis is grace. Grace. This is the most important word. Well, this is the most important modern word in the Christian vocabulary. Grace. It's not used as much as you'd think in the New Testament, but it is a greeting. It's similar to the word ciao. So I'm not going to take anything away from the word grace. However, grace doesn't exactly mean what you think it means. When cario, when every other word you say, if I greet you, I say, caris, cario, caris, cario. Ciao, ciao bello, right? Anyone been to Italy? Ciao bello, ciao bella. It's a very personal greeting, which is very interesting in itself. It's a personal greeting, intimate greeting. But the word grace isn't exactly what you may think it is. So put that into your cultural dictionary or understanding. So let's go back and looking at chapter 16 in 15. This is beginning of the death of Jesus. I told you to go back just a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail, but the Stratoni, the legionnaires, literally the ones who held the line in Greek, the soldiers, led Jesus away into the open yard, the quad of the barracks, the praetorium. And I already talked about that. The place, and called together, sukaleo, not ekkaleo, but sukaleo, the whole company of the cohort. So the whole cohort. There was probably, this gives us the impression there was at least a cohort in Jerusalem. In Centurion, when I wrote the book, I told you there were probably 2 cohorts. Usually the Roman legion put 2 cohorts in a place. You didn't put a single cohort. And usually what you did is you mix and match your cohorts. So in Centurion, guess which cohorts were there? There's 10 cohorts usually in a legion, and the first cohort, or the first cohort is made of double legions. It's the primus, and the primus pilus. And by the way, that's where the head of the legion and all the guys are, and guess where the questionare is? The questionare, the guy who executes prisoners, who tortures prisoners, is in the primus pilus. So let me see, I try to draw. I think this is really interesting. If you look at Centurion, I got all this stuff in there, and if you read it, this is the part that I think the guys really like, but the ladies always say I don't like because it's full of military stuff. But I kind of am really excited and interested about how the legions were put together. So you have a cohort, you have six cohorts. I think this is right. I have to go back and rewrite my notes. You have 6 cohorts, and in each cohort you have legions, and I believe there's 10 legions in each cohort, except the Primus, and the Primus has 6 legions, and they're double legions. So these legions have 80 men. You know, a legion is supposed to have how many? 100. But they always had 80. Isn't that interesting? Around 80. And then these are double legions, so there's 160 in each of these. And this is called the Primus. That's the Primus. And then this is the last cohort, and maybe there's 10 cohorts. The last one is I believe it's called the 10th. Decimus? Decimus, something like that. If anyone's read Centurion, I got to go back and reread my own book. If anyone's read Centurion in a while, all this is detailed in there, and I even have pictures on my website, so you can see I should have looked at the pictures. But the Decimus, when they put the cohorts together, this is the least experienced and the least prominent cohort. This is the most prominent. All the officers are usually in this cohort, the officers of the legion. As a matter of fact, the head of the legion is the Primus Pilus. The Primus Pilus is the Primus Pilus is the centurion that's the head of the Primus Pilus century. And above him, the only person above him in the whole thing, the legion's really cool because it's totally efficient. Everybody fights, except for the very top leader. The very top leader is the head of the legion, and guess who he is? He is the senatorial representative. He is the guy, he's the legiones. He is the legate. The legate. The legate is the very head of the legion. He is not the warhead of the legion. When you go to war, the Primus Pilus is the one who's in charge of the legion. This guy is the guy who represents the Senate from Rome, and guess what he controls? Food, economics. In the modern era, it'd be like ammunition. He's basically the legate, well, not the quartermaster, he's just the guy in charge of all the logistics for the legion, and also tells him what to do. So if he says, okay, today we're taking that hill, the job of the Primus Pilus is to take that hill. When you have a whole legion together, it's like 2,000 guys. It's a huge number of forces. A couple of cohorts is pretty large also. But generally, like I said, they put 2 cohorts together. And that's what I had in Centurion. In any case.
How many legions did Rome have? I mean, they have them regionally laid out. They might have an East Legion or a West Legion.
That's a great question. I believe at the peak they had like around 20 legions. 20, 25 legions. The legions were numbered, but it's not super clear. It's not like the Romans, we think the Romans kept enormously great data on all their stuff, but a lot of the data has not come to us over time. It was either lost or destroyed, or, a lot of it was, the Romans more than anyone, the Romans more than the Greeks. The Greeks like to write about philosophy, right? What do you think the Romans like to write about?
War.
No!
Or engineering?
Well,
Practical stuff.
Practical stuff. They were the engineering guys, so you're more likely to find a document in Rome about how they were putting up a road or a cathedral or building a legion camp. There's all kinds of data about building legion camps. The only problem about building the legion camps, there's lots of data about building them, but there's not a whole lot of data about staffing them. We think it's because, if you look in Centurion, you see their system is very stratified or set. Stratified is not a good word. It's set in place. In other words, the way they design the legions, the way they man the legions, the way they train the legions, they've been doing this for 500 years maybe. And so they've just gotten really good at it. So if you're really good at it, do you need to write it down? No, you don't write anything down like that. You know, it's not like the modern era where, you know, we have our training documents, we change them every 6 months or so, right? They were smart because they found something that worked. Unfortunately, against the Parthians and the Carthaginians and the Scythians, it was not very effective. And basically, the Roman legions got trounced by eventually horse and arrow troops. The legions were not arrow forces, did not carry arrow forces till way late. And if you remember, in Centurion, there's usually two legions called Ducations. There's two legions of horse troops. But in that era, the horse troops could not carry an armored man. So they weren't armored. So they were used, the Ducarion were used specifically to harass troops, harass the enemy, you know, when they retreated, and to do cleanup exercises and also for reconnaissance. And that was all they used them for.
Pickets? Like pickets or?
More like the Roman legions in that era, they weren't fighting at that time a lot of horsebound. Horses could not carry armored warriors in that period. You had to wait until about the 600 to 1000 AD period before horses were large enough, had been bred large enough to carry armed warriors. So it was impossible for horses to carry anyone, except for the Scythians and Parthians. Basically, both of their societies were based in non-armored warriors, and they used recurve bows. And the recurve bows were able to puncture the armor of the Romans, and they used a lot of them. So the Romans were never into bows and arrows until late. They used slings. In Centurion, you'll see they were using some slings, which were kind of popular in that period because you could just pick up rocks, right? But they usually had only their throwing, the names, I can't remember the names, but they had the throwing spear and they had the set spear. And they had the two types of spears they used, and that was it. They weren't issued generally anything other than that. They sometimes had slingers, but that was about all. So, you know, until the advent of basically the Scythians, and you know who the Scythians eventually became, right? Genghis Khan. The Khans and all the guys coming, that's basically where the Scythians came from. They had recurved bows, which gave them enormous power, the ability to puncture armor, and that was what basically caused huge problems in medieval Europe, because by that they hadn't invented gunpowder, right? And their armor was not very strong. And remember, the only guys who had armor were the knights, and the knights were the leaders, and everybody else was like not well armored. So it was only, and by the way, which nation invented the next great invention in bow warfare?
Crossbow?
The crossbow was an excellent way to puncture armor, but it really was late. What was the early dudes who invented an incredible weapon, bow weapon? The longbow. The longbow in, what's the famous battle? The Battle of where Richard III.
Agincourt.
What?
Agincourt?
Agincourt. At Agincourt. In Agincourt, the British longbow defeated the French armor like, and you know what that means, right? They weren't killing the common guys, they were killing the knights. Whoa! You know, so you had yeomen that were wiping out the knights. This is like that. But that was, the longbow was one of the reasons that, well, the Khans killed themselves off, and they had lots of other problems. There were huge other problems why the Khans could not continue to maintain their control in Europe. But the longbow was banned by the Pope.
So was the bolt.
Which they ignored. Well, I don't remember the bolt being banned, but the longbow was definitely banned by the Pope, especially after, after the Agincourt was the thing that propelled it. But then later on, remember, Henry VIII, right? And so the Pope was not very happy with the Brits anyway. So, oh well, you know, they banned battleships too because they were the weapons of mass destruction. In any case, what's important to us is the Legion. This is all stuff that the average kid knew about, right? In this era. Don't you know this, right? What do you think the most exciting thing? Look, there was no baseball, there's no soccer, there's no football, there's no sports, and there's no TV, the idols of the modern era. So
Cowboys and Indians.
What was the most exciting thing to the kids in that era?
Soldiers.
The soldiers. Every kid wanted to be a soldier. Every kid wanted to, you know, get out of what they were doing and go do something exciting in the world. And every day, guess what they saw in this area? Soldiers. They saw the legions. You know, and that's what I try to picture in the book. So anyway.
Soldier trading cards?
Well, they probably need trading cards. I'm surprised the pastor didn't mention the #1 idol of America in his sermon today, the TV. Don't bow to that idol. 17. They invested in Didusko. They didn't clothe him. They invested him in the purple muscle, not a robe. Robe was added, so they probably put a stole on him. Braided together a crown, a wreath, a thorny wreath, and placed it on him. Okay, so 18, they began to call out. It's not call out, it's aspinmozai. They began to enfold him in their arms and say to him, Chario, grace, grace, King of the Jews.
Here it says salute him in EXP.
They literally, in the word, and I should have given you this word. This word is from a union, a negative participle union. Here, I'll write it out. A-S-P-A-Z-O-M-A-I. It's A as a negative participle, or no, participle of union. This can be negative and it can be a union. So it's a union participle, and from spemozai, which means to enfold in the arms. So in other words, this word means to put your arms around him. What do you think this was doing? What's the big deal about putting your arms around somebody? Okay.
Invading his personal space.
Invading the personal space, exactly. Now this could probably give you a clue about the Romans themselves. Okay, in our personal space, if I'm hearing them talking to you, that's probably about right? If I come up to here, oh, he's feeling uncomfortable, oh yeah, right? When I've been up in Iceland, the Icelandic people will get right up in your nose, like nose to nose, and you're like, oh, get out of my space. You know, so you're back and they're coming. It's like, because that's their normal space. What do you think the Roman legions, or the Romans, where do you think their space is? What do you think the Hebrew space is? The Romans were known, okay? How did they greet one another? Matter, how do we greet? How does the medieval, how does the Christian Germanic, greeting? What is the greeting in the Middle Ages? Handshake. What's the greeting in this era? Right? Hey, don't get near me, dude. Like that. It's the they don't touch. So if you touch someone, what are you doing?
You're intimidating them.
You're intimidating them, and this is shaming. I talked about this last week. What they did. Number one, when they put a robe, when they put a stole, no robe. There's no robe. When they put purple around him, it was probably Pilate's purple. What were they doing? What were they showing that Jesus was? King. He is a king. And so part of Roman law or Roman punishment, is part of the punishment in the ancient world. We don't do this anymore because it's too cruel and unusual, right? In the ancient world, part of their thing was shaming. Shaming. And so how do you shame a king?
Invade his space.
You put matter of fact, they honored him by putting purple, and it was not a dishonor for them to put a crown of thorns on his head. That was hugely affirming. Hugely affirming. A crown of thorns. Remember, these guys are guys who made crowns of thorns or crowns of laurels, right? To them, to put a crown, you never can forget this. We have taken it to mean something negative in our culture, but to put a crown of thorns on somebody's head is being absolutely, they are putting him on a peak of a pinnacle. The cost of, for example, that purple stole is probably beyond the cost anybody's paid for a year. Very expensive. To put a crown on the guy's head to both the legions, to the Greeks, to anybody in that culture. That's a huge positive. That's not a negative, even though it's thorns. I told you before, the thorns probably indicated, the negativity of the thorns is that it's suffering, right? It's part of the shaming. The shaming. If you wanted to lift a king up, what would you do? What would you put on him?
Laurel or gold.
Yeah, gold, laurel. Okay, now, when Jesus had this stole on, what else did he have on?
Toga.
No, he had nothing else on. This is part of shaming. He was naked. As a matter, we're going to find out in a moment. They give him back his summation, his Greek robes. So in other words, when they put the stole on him, they took his other clothing. Why would they do that?
It's very embarrassing.
Shame him. Don't damage the clothing too, because they were going to get it. We'll see that too. Again and again, 19, and again, tupto, repeated blows. They struck him on the kephela, on the head. Remember, the kephela doesn't necessarily mean the head part, but rather the part sticking out that protects, which is very interesting in Greek, with a kalamos, a reed, and impetuo, spit on him or at him, falling to place on the knee, not their knees. I don't know why they do that. It was gonu, on the knee. They paid homage. Literally, they fawned like a dog to him. What are they doing to him?
Mocking him.
They are mocking and shaming. But there's not much mocking in here. Okay, look, guys, I know you don't think this like they do. What does it mean if you go down to your knee to a person? How much mocking is in going to your knee and fawning?
You're
Subordinating.
You're putting yourself under them.
Because Pilate told them that he was a king. He is a king. And if you look in Centurion make a huge point. And if you look at the other Gospels, it's not as evident in Mark. It's evident, I think, to the cultural reader in Mark. But it's more evident in Matthew and Luke and John that when Pilate says it directly, crucify him as a king. Pilate is in the work right now of crucifying Jesus Christ as a king. He told his legions, and this gives you the impression of what? Do they do this often? They never do this, right? If Pilate decrees, number one, if Pilate says to his questionaries, probably Gaius Flaccus, that's who we think it was in history, and tells the questionaries, the torturer and executioner of the legion, part of the primus, and says, execute him as a king. What does that mean that Gaius Flaccus knows?
Standing order number one.
He has to do things differently.
He knows how to execute a man as a king. He knows how to do it. If he goes to the legion and says, shame this man, or basically, well, he did. He said, shame him as a king. What does that mean? The legion knows how to shame a king. And by the way, we don't know much about Pilate, but who do you think Pilate could have removed? Herod. Which one?
Yeah.
Take your pick, right? Herod had 4 children, and how many of them are extant right now? Possibly 2. One was banished to Gaul, to France. This was before they had good cooking. So he was in France, Gaul, not a very happy situation. He may have been on the beach, but he probably had a wood hut, right? Herod Antipas is the head of the Galil, right? And Herod Antipas is probably in Jerusalem right now for the Passover, because he was a Jew, even though he wasn't supposed to be, his enemy. So it's possible that Pilate may have been commissioned to remove 2 other kings. That's maybe how he became the tetrarch, or the... Yes, sir?
To support your point, when you think about it, as the Roman Empire was forming, they probably had a chance to depose dozens of kings, so they had a lot of practice.
Well, what you said is right, and I'm glad you said it, because remember, how many nation states are there in the ancient world?
Everywhere.
Yeah.
How many nation states?
Oh.
0. What are they?
City states.
They're city states. Every city state has their own dude, right? Their own king. Athens had their own king. Thebes had their own king. Macedonia had their own king. Even when they were a democracy, Athens had a king. In the second mission, I talk about it. In fact, Socrates even went to see him. Yeah.
So Pilate really didn't think Jesus was a king. Was he doing that just to kind
I
of
think-
stick a stick in Herod's eye?
I think he was acknowledging he was a king.
But why
And
would
it's
he
probably
believe that?
to
The
show
Jews told him
disrespect,
he was a king.
they probably had, this was probably a nice opportunity for them not so much to disrespect Christ, but the Jewish enclave that was there.
I agree 100%, right? This is that logos to telos thing. Remember, in a telos, will the Greek ever tell you the conclusion?
No.
No. So what do they want you to do is do what? Make your own conclusion based on the evidence presented in the logos. And so the logos, Pilate calls him a king 3 times, right? Pilate tells him to execute Jesus as a king. And I think what Dave said is right on. I think Pilate sees this as an opportunity to a degree, at least from Mark's point of view, to make fun, or make fun is not a good word, to show his power over the Jews. Today in the readings, the reading is from Luke, about, remember the Galileans, those from the Galilee that Pilate sprinkled with their sacrifices? And then Jesus talks about the Tower of Siloam. Remember that? Shalom? Okay. This is a huge deal because Josephus talks about these 2 events, both of these events, in his writings. In one of them, we know that what happened was, and I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again because this is really neat stuff. When Pilate brought the Imagios, the aquifer of the legion, who was part of the primus, who's part of this group, the aquifer, the guy who carries, there were guys who carried, remember I told you in a legion. In a legion you have your legionnaires, you have your guidon bearer, and his name is an imagio bearer, and then you have the centurion, the optio, and the tesarius. And so the guidon bearers who could not be promoted to optio became, or maybe they were promoted to optio, but later on they were not able to serve in their legions very well, were made the aquifers for the legion. The aquifers for the legion carried the imagios and the guidon, the symbols. They didn't have flags in those days. They had things on poles. And almost all the legions, all the Caesar's legions were known by having a what? Caesar. These things are stuff that, I wish they taught to kids back in 6th grade, because this is kind of stuff, like for example, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the end of the Roman Empire in 70 BC, why isn't that taught to every kid, right, in 6th grade? In 6th grade, you should know that all of Caesar's legions carried what for their primary aquifer?
Crooked cross.
No, bull. That's why you know it's a Caesar legion, is they had bulls. The Ferratus and the Forensis, which, by the way, were probably the 2 that were in Jerusalem at that time, or that area, they had bulls. They were Caesar's legions. Caesar created new legions when he became the head of the Roman Empire. When he made the Roman Empire, he made new legions. All of Caesar's legions carried bulls. Other legions carried other aquifers. So the way you know they're early legions versus late legions is because of what they carried. And so in the front were these guys carried. Now, during the empire period, they began carrying imagios. An imagio is a stick or a pole that had a picture of the emperor on it. Okay, I was going to draw a side thing, but I drew a happy face. It had a picture of the emperor. Now, what was the problem with that for the Greeks, or for the Jews?
No images.
Yeah, no images before God. Pilate in Centurion, I make this point. I think Pilate was clueless when he first took over in Judea. He had no clue. So what did he do? He marched his legions, his cohorts in, and they were carrying the aquifers and imagios. And when they went into Jerusalem, can you see what the people were doing? they're not going to even look at it, right? What this caused was, see, most of the time, Pilate spent his time in Caesarea Maritima. Here's the coast, here's Jerusalem, here's Caesarea Maritima, which happened to be in the Galilee. And so the people would not, the Pharisees and Sadducees wouldn't make a big deal in Jerusalem, but when Pilate went back to Caesarea Maritima, and that's where he may have been there, right? So what did they do? They fomented a little bit of revolt, a little bit of a protest. And during that protest, Pilate, at the time, was an early procurator, so what did he do? He said, and that's what they did. There were all these people from the Galilee, Jews protesting the Magios in Jerusalem, according to Josephus, and he croaked them, killed them all. So that's what he says when they sprinkled their blood with the sacrifices. That's what they meant. Basically, Pilate had him killed. Now, after that, Pilate snuck the Magios back out of Jerusalem, and we know things went a little better. In my book, I say that it's because of Abinadar, who was one of his leaders in the legion, who was helping him to catch a clue. Whatever reason, either he caught a clue, got better spies, or started to figure out the people. But after that, we know that Pilate's association with the Jews got better, in spite of what they say. And at this point, Pilate's kind of at this peak. He's at the peak of positive. I'm not sure that Pilate was really making fun of the Jews. Remember, the Jews gave him Jesus. What do you think Pilate's, at this point, what do you think Pilate's ultimate goal in doing this is? Remember, he gave him Barabbas? Barabba. Barabba means son of the Father. So who else wants to be king? Barabbas wants to be king, right? Because if you're king, Maccabeans, the Maccabeans were priests and kings. Therefore the Messiah, right? Barabbas, that's why he calls himself this. He wants to be the Messiah. That means he wants to be a king. So what message is Pilate sending? It's a freebie.
You chose wrong.
You chose poorly, right? You're picking the Holy Grail. You chose poorly, right? Because, number one, Barabbas is out again, right? He obviously caused problems for the Romans. Well, actually, he probably didn't cause many problems for the Romans. He probably caused mostly problems for the Jews. But Pilate's whole thing is he's got a tribute to give, right? And if the Jews aren't happy, they aren't giving him bucks. He wants the bucks to give to the Roman Senate, because if he can't continue to give the tribute, what happens to him?
He goes to Gaul.
He gets a free Gallian vacation. This is the way it works. I mean, this isn't very positive. Actually, the Romans weren't as bad as you think, but they were pretty strict about the people that were in leadership. When they give you, look, if I'm the CEO of a company, like, obviously Pilate is like the CEO of a country, right? His job is to provide the tribute to Rome. His job is to make the people happy so they don't revolt, right? So what does he do? He applies Roman law the best he can. He applies his forces. He probably had 2 legions to use, we think, the Francus and the Francis. So he probably had 2 legions that he was using, both of them Caesarian-type legions. So his job, I've given you 2 legions. I've given you all this authority, right? So what do I expect from as a Roman Senate and the Roman Emperor?
Results.
Yeah, give me some results, dude. If you pitch in a little bit extra to the tribute, I'll be happier, right? Pilate does not want revolt. Pilate does not want economic anarchy. He wants peace in his own time. That's what he's looking for, right? And so far he's held it pretty well. Because right now, who's colluding with Pilate? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, everybody's colluding with Pilate, right? Pilate's just kind of setting up a situation here. So anyway, whatever you want to pull at it, this is what they're going to look at 20. And when they had mocked, literally, empazeo, when they had jeered at him, when they had jeered at him. Okay, this cannot be any more obvious, right? Mark tells us when they had shamed him enough, impezeo, when they had jeered at him enough, basically, they took off the purple, not robe is added, they took off the purple and put his own himation, his Greek garment, on him. So obviously they took it off him, so he was naked. This was part of the shaming. Then they exago, they led him forth out to stereo him. What's very interesting about this, there's lots of words that the Greek author here, Mark, could have chosen instead of exago, lead forth. Where did we see exago before? When Jesus told his disciples, when they were all running away, just before they ran away, he said to them, exago, lead. When they took him to see the court, see the Sanhedrin, they said exago. In other words, Jesus asked the disciples to lead. But who's leading? The Sanhedrin that took him, now the Romans. They're leading him out to crucify him. I think it's very interesting. In any case, according to Mark, now this is Mark. In Centurion, I had them in the book. I took other stuff. I tried to, what do you call them? I tried to put the Gospels together so that they were understandable within a English standpoint. So I remember at the very beginning it said that Pilate had him whipped. Now, Pilate had him whipped. It was probably whipped with a stares, the whip that had the stuff on the ends of it. You know, well, they call it kind of nine tails, but it's really not. It's a 7-thing whip that has metal at the end, and that's what the questionaries usually used. And so in my book, and also it gives the impression he did. But what Mark is trying to do, Mark is trying to, remember I told you, in the Gospels, we expect in English a point by point, this is what happens, right? But in a Greek document, what Mark is trying to do is not give you a point to point. What he's trying to do is give you the logos to tell us, right? So you draw the proper conclusion. So he kind of, downplays the concept of the whipping and upplays the concept of the shaming. Because his focus is to point you to the fact that Pilate acknowledged Jesus as the King of the Jews. And not only that, who else acknowledged him?
The high priest.
Well, the high priest, and who else?
His wife.
Well, his wife, well, that's in another gospel. But the big deal is the Romans did. The Romans did. The Roman legion. I mean, what better authority do you have than Pilate and the Roman legion that are saying that Jesus is the king? Yeah.
Well, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, he was also received as a king by the people that were there. And I'm sure Pilate was aware of the situation because a big crowd gathered and they were receiving him coming into the city as a king.
Yeah, but remember, he came on the foal of a donkey. Remember, we went through this. And so he was, remember, the question of kingship, the son of David came up when he was in Jericho, right? And the guy, Bartimaeus, whatever, the blind dude, right? The blind dude who was healed, he looked up. He was able to look into the heavens and he says, "You are the son of David." And from that point on, Jesus was downplaying that, right? He tried to downplay it over and over again. He never said anything. Who was the first one that called him the King of the Jews? Not Jesus. Pilate, the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin implied it. They said, son of David, right? But the guy who actually said it was Pilate. Pronounced him the King of the Jews. And the Sanhedrin, the high priest, basically told Pilate, right? You can't get much better authority than that. I mean, if the President of the United States kind of came to me and said, "You're the King of the Jews," I mean, well, maybe that might not mean anything, but maybe the Pope, right? I don't know. If somebody in great authority, announced that you are the King of the Jews, right? At least that's a Dan Brown moment in any case. So, when they had mocked him enough, they took off the purple and put on his own clothes, his himation, his Greek robe. And remember, people didn't wear any underwear. I don't care what you see in the pictures. There's no underwear going on anywhere, okay, in this period. They led him forth to crucify him. In 21. I had some other notes.
What was the name of the undergarment again?
Oh.
Mark, the young man who ran away naked.
Yeah, a wealthy guy might have, and it was a linen garment, a stiation. I'd have to look back at my notes. Anybody remember
But
the
it
list?
wasn't one of those, they didn't put that on it?
No, they, well, it doesn't, look, okay, now this is, I think, important in the Greek. If the Greeks said it, Syndona. If the Greeks said it, then we can take it, right? You can take it, run with it. But the problem is, in that period, to have that garment meant that you were what? Very wealthy, right? And although Jesus is a free man, and he probably has a degree of wealth beyond what maybe the paupers or common people have, because he was a professional person, right? He likely did not have, and probably from his being raised up. I mean, if you were raised up in a wealthy family and you're used to wearing that kind of garment, you'd probably wear that kind of garment, right? But if you weren't, all you'd have is a himation. You probably had a himation and a pelopus. The himation is the underrobe, the pelopus is the overrobe. And so that's Greek. That's the way the Greeks would say it. What the Jews would call it, I don't know. I haven't looked into the Jewish, because they're all Greek. They're all wearing Greek clothes, right? If you had some guy or woman wearing Hebraic clothing in this period, what would you say?
You would have called it that Hebrew.
Yeah, it would probably, in the Greek especially, would have remarked it, but that would be calling big attention to yourself. It probably didn't exist. Because remember, these guys have been Hellenized for 500 years. 500 years, and that's longer than our country has been existing, right? So Hellenization for that long, there's no way they're not wearing. They're wearing the modern Greek, you know, they've got the modern, you know, down their catwalks, they've got the modern Greek clothing and stuff in that period. Okay, in 21, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, and look what it says. Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing on his way, literally parago, led near. On his way, you get it? Tin hodos? Tin hodos? The way. He was passing on his way, para ego. I just think this is great. You know, Mark just throws these things in. He was passing on his way. Okay, now this is a code word. What is this telling us in the Greek?
He was a follower of Jesus.
He was probably a follower. And look what it says. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Okay, what does this imply, guys?
Everybody knows who Alexander and Rufus are.
Everybody in Teen Hodos knows who these guys are, right? I mean, you just don't throw names out like, you know. The point is that Mark is writing to an audience of Greeks and Romans, right? And Alexander and Rufus are obviously, Alexander is a Greek name. Rufus could be Greek, it was probably Roman. In any case, a man from Cyrene who was in the way, right? Teen Hodos, and they mentioned two guys. Now, it's also possible that Alexander and Rufus are in some place in the rest of the gospel. I want you to think about this because we'll see this again. In ancient literature, just like the kid that ran away, right? In ancient literature, people thought it was impolite or inappropriate, improper to call attention to the author or to specific people. But there was nothing wrong with calling attention to specific people within the context of the document. In other words, when the author was writing, let's say, an episode, let's say the woman who broke the alabaster jar of perfume, remember? It doesn't tell us who her name is, right? That would be considered inappropriate in most Greek writing. It's okay to mention names of, let's say, Greeks or Romans or high officials. But it's not right in their cultural view, in their view of literature, to put the name of it. However, what you usually did as a Greek writer is guess where you threw it?
Some other place.
Especially at the end of the document. So now I start naming names at the end of the document. And because everybody already knows, see, I'm not giving you a story. It's not a story. I'm writing a logos to telos. That's a history, right? It's a logos to telos to explain to you some very important fact, right? So while I'm writing it, I'm not going to tell you who it is. But guess what? You all know who I'm talking about, right? Because the point isn't the person, the point isn't the name of the woman, right? The point is what she did and how it fits within the logos to telos, the logical argument to the telos, right? So what happens when I'm writing it, all of a sudden I just toss it out at the end as a remember. And then when you hear it read, what do you know immediately? As the hearer of the document. You
know that it's
remember.
authentic because they mentioned people that you are aware of.
Bingo. Exactly. So who was Alexander and Rufus? We don't know. Alexander and Rufus may be somebody that Mark mentioned. I didn't go back and look to see. In the first century, these guys would have been known. They were obviously known to, they were so well known to Teen Hodos that when they say a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing on, it was Parageo. He was going on his way. Everybody who reads it knows who he is. And not only knows who he is, but knows who his sons are. Wow. Okay, so it goes on. In from the country, agros, a field. So he's obviously a farmer. And they, agereo, they pressed into public service. Huh. He wasn't forced. He was pressed into public service. I get pressed into public service all the time. I'm working on my taxes right now. They've impressed my labor. Okay? He was agareo, pressed into... Why can't they translate these words? Why are they so afraid to translate these words the way they should be translated? He was not forced. He was pressed into public service. You know why? For him to carry the cross. Why was he pressed into public service? Anybody know the law? The Roman law at this time? The Roman law was that a Roman soldier could ask you, could force you, compel you to carry a load for them for 1 mile. No further. Mark, this was the thing when Jesus says, if a soldier asks you to carry it a mile, why? What would happen to the soldier?
He'd be shamed.
No, he'd be executed. Yeah, because, see, the Romans weren't dummies. The Romans did not want to irritate you too much, right? But, you know, the Roman packs were heavy. If you read Centurion, they double pack them. They're really heavy. Now, a trainee couldn't ask you, but a full centurion or full legionnaire could ask you to carry his pack. It's a pretty heavy pack. So it's like, you know, these guys are trudging down the road. It's like, well, I don't want to walk another mile with this. So they say, hey, you carry it. And he could do that. He could compel you to walk with him, do it a mile, walk him the mile. But if you kept going, he could be executed. And not only that, who's seeing you run with his pack? They never sent legionnaires by themselves. I mean, they weren't idiots, right? They're always in groups of at least 4. And so all the other legionnaires and the centurion would see you. And it's like, hey, wait. Plus you'd be carrying his pack. You know? And I'm just saying. So anyway, they forced him into public service to carry the cross. And they could do that. That was a legal method. 22. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha. Now, you know, it says the place of the skull. Golgotha literally means the skull. The reason it's the skull, and we don't know if the place still exists or not. Remember I told you the Romans liked to put bodies up around the cities. They didn't want them too close because that stunk. So they put them out a ways. And apparently there was an area that had a pretty high peak like this. And what the Romans did is the Romans were pretty smart. They would pre-drill holes. They would pre-cut holes in the ground for crosses. And so we know that if you go look in the way into some Roman cities along Roman roads, one of the first things they look for are potholes, post dig holes, because that's where they put crosses. So the Romans had areas like the Appian Way, for example, where outside of the Roman cities, where they would crucify people. In Jerusalem, there should be an area like that, and there was an area called the Skull, literally skull. Golgotha means the skull. It was a knoll that looked like the top of the skull. In 23, now look, this is really interesting stuff. They offered pino, they imbibed. Remember, this is the same word used in the Last Supper. They not offered, they imbibed him onios. Now, by the way, this is really interesting. The word onios is not used. Onios means wine in Hebrew. It's not used in the Last Supper at all. There's the implication that it was onios, that it was wine, but the word isn't used. But the word pino, imbibe, is used. What do you think Mark is doing here? This is called an analogy. This is an analogy in Mark to the Last Supper. Remember, Jesus told them at the Last Supper, I will not do what?
Drink wine until I come into my Father's kingdom.
He specifically said, I will not drink the cup, which the implication is wine. But it doesn't say onios. It says, I will not drink of the cup. Now, there's a very important part about this. What is the cup he's talking about? We kind of yacked about this a little bit when we were talking about the Last Supper. In the Last Supper, okay, in a Passover Seder. In a Passover Seder, okay, first of all, I have the matzah. And what do I do with the matzah?
Break it.
Into what? How much?
3.
3. I break the matzah into 3 pieces. One is put away, the Messiah's matzah. That is the matzah for the Messiah. It's just put away. Never to be seen again. The second piece is called the hidden matzah. And this is what they hide around the house, right, for the kids to find. And the other part is broken and used for the eating, for the Passover. Okay, what do you do with the wine, with the cup?
Drink a whole bunch.
You drink a whole bunch, that's correct. Everybody gets a cup, and then there is what? An extra,
There's Elijah has his cup.
there is an extra cup for Elijah, right? The extra cup, the extra wine. Many Messianic Jews believe that Jesus took this matzah for the Last Supper and drank from Elijah's cup. The last cup. Now, before they put him on the cross, they pino him onios mixed with myrrh, mingled with myrrh, narcotic. Why did they offer him? Why did they specifically, number one, the part of it, the reason is the mention, because this is an analogy back to the Last Supper and what Jesus told them, and to the cup of Ezekiel or Elisha, right? The other part of this is, why did they offer him a narcotic?
Because he's a king.
You told us before they did it, because it's customary to try to blunt some of the pain.
If I am asked, okay, if I just am asked, go crucify him. How do I crucify him? What do I do?
Tie him to the cross.
I tie him, yeah. I take a cross, usually without much thought, and I tie you to it. I tie you with ties. Zip ties. No, with ropes. I put with ropes. Why?
Struggle.
Iron.
Well,
Slow death.
slow death. Slow death, you don't die very quickly. Now, if I tell them, and we know this happened, if I tell them to crucify you as a king, what do I do?
Stake him to the cross.
I put wooden stakes, no nails. There are no iron nails. If I put iron nails, the minute I looked away, the people would jump up there and take the iron, because iron was used to make currency. Iron was worth big money. So I used wooden stakes, and I usually reused them. So I reused the crosses too, and I reused the rope. You look in Centurion, the Gaius Flaccus went to the quartermaster to get the pieces he required, and they're like, not clean, right? They don't clean them after each execution. You just have them there at the quartermaster. Quartermaster throws it to him over the Dutch window. Here you go, dude. It's like, here, you carry this, right? So he got stakes, and the wooden stakes, what they did is they placed them between the ulna and radialis, You guys know, look, you guys study this, right? They always teach you this stuff. You got your radius and ulna and radialis, right? Have I said it right? Probably not. Anyway, you got, what's that?
Radius, I
Ra-
think.
Radius and ulna. Anyway, it's been a while since I studied anatomy. But anyway, you have 2 bones in your wrist. You also have 2 bones here, right? That's what allows you to rotate your foot and legs. And so what they did is they would tie this off, because if they accidentally hit an artery,
You're dead then.
you're dead quick. And the point was not to let you die fast, but if I put, like, if I staked you to a cross, what good does that do? What does that help?
Yeah, it lets more blood out.
Yeah, lets more blood out, you die from shock. You don't die from shock this way, you drown. But if I make holes in your, like, between your bones, then you will die from shock. And you'll die from bleeding. And so that's what I want to do. But I don't want to hit your arteries. So why give the guy a narcotic?
Flinching, just pound it in.
Exactly. You don't want him moving. So I'm going to have guys hold you down. I'll probably tie you down too. But I don't want you flinching. And plus I'm going to cut off your circulation so you don't bleed to death right away. And then I'll probably let it out. This doesn't sound very fun, does it? In Centurion, I talk about exactly how they do this, but it's kind of interesting stuff, right? It's not what we see in the pictures. It's a little bit different than the picture books. But what they did is, Gaius Flaccus was an expert at this. He was supposed to be an expert, because what would happen if he screwed up?
The guy would die.
Practice on him.
Yeah, well, basically, when, he had outs, right? There were outs. But if I didn't do the right tourniquet technique, and you bled out, what do you think Pilate's going to do? He's not going to be very happy. And if at the best you could be executed, at the worst you could be executed. At the best, he would find somebody else to take your job. Do you think there's lots of other people in this legion that would like your job? I mean, the questionaries gets to have a lot of fun, right? Ooh, so to speak. Anyway, just saying. I mean, look. They'll pay you more. Well, they don't necessarily pay you more, but at least you have more entertainment. You probably get more food. In any case, Gaius Flaccus does not want to screw this up. He wants to do it right, and there are specific ways of doing this. Jesus would not take the wine, which is part of what he said. Remember, this goes back to the Last Supper. In any case, that's the time, and so we're right up to the crucifixion. We'll talk about that next week. Lord God, thank you for this day. We thank you for the information you give us through your word. We pray that you bless us this week. In your name we pray, amen.
Does the new semester start next week?
I don't know.
It does.